Do you truly believe you know the people who move within your orbit? You walk through existence convinced that you possess the discernment to recognize a toxic presence, to feel when an atmosphere grows heavy, or to judge precisely when a line of acceptable human conduct has been crossed. Yet, what if I were to tell you that the most profound psychological dangers in this life are never the obvious ones? Throughout my decades of clinical work and intense personal exploration of the human psyche, I have discovered that the most destructive forces do not announce themselves with harsh gestures or overt malice. They arrive disguised in charm, wrapped in kindness, or embedded deep within the sanctum of your own family. And while you exhaust your conscious energy trying to shield yourself from recognizable villains, you quietly open the wide, unguarded doors of your mind to something infinitely more perilous, the invasion of another person's unconscious. In my work, The Ego and the Unconscious, I demonstrated that the vast majority of what truly governs human thought, emotion, and behavior lies far beyond the reach of conscious awareness. This is not merely a statement about your inner life. It is an absolute truth regarding everyone around you, and precisely there lies the subtle horror of our shared existence. When an individual remains blind to their own internal darkness, when they refuse to face their own shadow, that shadow does not simply vanish, it seeks a host. And all too often, that host becomes you. Perhaps you have never paused to contemplate this quiet invasion. But look back now upon your own path. How many times have you stepped away from a simple conversation feeling inexplicably hollowed out, as though your vital force had been silently harvested? How many times have you found yourself bearing the weight of an accusation for an act you never committed, or forced into the exhausting role of savior in a private tragedy that was never yours to resolve? I have termed this mechanism projection. It is an entirely unconscious process wherein an individual disowns what they cannot tolerate within themselves and casts it outward, pinning it directly onto you. From that moment forward, in the eyes of the projector, you cease to exist as an authentic, living human being. You are reduced to a symbol, a mirror, an imaginary antagonist, or an idealized hero. Yet, examine all these projections closely, and you will find one unwavering reality. None of them have anything to do with who you truly are. The most unsettling aspect of this psychological phenomenon is that you rarely realize you have been drawn into the game. You tell yourself that you are merely being supportive, empathetic, or mature. Meanwhile, you are sinking deeper into a dense, alien psychic field, straining to resolve conflicts you did not create, manipulated by invisible dynamics that now dictate your emotional reality. I must make this clear. The greatest psychological threats to your well-being do not originate from conscious, calculating perverts of morality. They emanate from the unintegrated, unconscious individuals. These are people who exist alienated from their own psyche, entirely possessed by their social masks, their unhealed traumas, their hidden complexes, and their deeply repressed desires. They are not inherently evil, but they are profoundly dangerous. Their influence is silent. It does not breach your boundaries with a violent blow. It infiltrates slowly, day by day, through veiled remarks, heavy silences, subtle insinuations, and indirect accusations, until you begin to doubt your own sanity and perception. And when you lose touch with your own psychic reality, you are absorbed into their shadow. You may be enduring this very ordeal at this precise moment, within a romantic partnership, a long-standing friendship, a professional environment, or deep within your domestic life. And perhaps, in your confusion, you have turned your scrutiny inward, blaming yourself, asking what fundamental flaw resides within your character. The answer is that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with you. However, there is something deeply distorted in how your spirit is being used as an empty vessel to contain the disowned psychological debris of another. Allow me to guide you through 6 distinct psychological profiles, patterns of personality that I have observed throughout my life's work. These are individuals who act not out of deliberate cruelty, but under the absolute command of internal forces they themselves do not comprehend. We shall draw upon the structural insights I set down in Aion, the ego and the unconscious, and archetypes and the collective unconscious, to expose how these dynamics operate. But more importantly, I ask you to maintain absolute emotional honesty. For as we examine these structural patterns, you may come to recognize that one or more of these shadows resides, waiting within yourself. Consider first the individual who turns your very presence into a persistent emotional trigger, transforming your relationship into a terrain where you are perpetually cast as the guilty party. At the outset, such a person appears remarkably delicate, deep, perhaps possessing an exquisite emotional vulnerability. Yet, as time marches on, a subtle shift occurs. You find yourself dragged onto a chaotic battlefield, one you never chose to enter, where you are somehow rendered defeated before the first word is spoken. This is the manifestation of the unconscious manipulator. Such an individual remains entirely oblivious to their own internal wounds, yet they compulsively project their unhealed suffering outward as a desperate mechanism of psychic survival. In my writings, I have observed that what we refuse to confront within ourselves we will inevitably meet outside as fate. And frequently this fate wears a familiar face, speaks with a gentle voice, and sits directly across from you at the dinner table. The unconscious manipulator is completely dominated by repressed psychological contents, unprocessed emotional fragments, and unintegrated traumas floating in the subterranean depths of their psyche. Lacking the courage or the psychological apparatus to look within, they aim their internal chaos directly at you, utilizing your personality as a blank canvas upon which to paint their torment. They exist in a state of chronic instinctual projection. Projection is, admittedly, an unavoidable function of the human mind. We all perceive the world through the lens of our internal architecture. However, when it remains unacknowledged, it becomes a psychological prison. As I explained in The Ego and the Unconscious, projection induces a form of severe psychic blindness. The other person is no longer perceived in their actual reality, but is instead transformed into a mere symbol for what lies buried within the projector's dark subterranean depths. The unconscious manipulator does not see you. They behold a forgotten, rejected fragment of their own soul, and they react to you with the full intensity of that buried reality. Consequently, such individuals assume a perpetual posture of victimization. Every misfortune, every uncomfortable internal state must be attributed to an external cause. If they are gripped by irrational rage, it is because your tone provoked them. If they drop into profound sadness, it is because you failed them. If they are haunted by feelings of inadequacy, it is because you carry yourself with unbearable superiority. This distortion is executed with such refined, unconscious subtlety that you begin to internalize their reality. You ask yourself, was I truly heartless? Did I miscalculate my words? Am I the source of this toxicity? Thus, the manipulation achieves its aim without a single explicit command being uttered. It is entirely emotional, completely submerged in the unconscious, and devastatingly effective. To make matters more complex, these individuals are frequently gifted with considerable charisma and an undeniable emotional magnetism. This creates a profound psychological trap. Your empathy is engaged. You convince yourself that with enough patience, insight, and love, you can heal their suffering. Yet, in practice, you are committing a quiet form of self-sacrifice, offering up your own psychic vitality in an attempt to rescue someone who actively refuses to descend into their own depths. The deeper you reach to pull them out, the further down into their personal abyss you are drawn. When you remain caught in these symbolic webs, playing the designated savior, the betrayer, the tyrant, or the nurturing parent, you abandon authentic existence. You cease to be a living subject and become a distorted reflection cast by another's hidden chaos. The only true defense against the unconscious manipulator is the immediate cultivation of rigorous self-awareness. You must learn to trace the invisible threads that tie your emotions to their narrative. You must continuously ask yourself the crucial question: is this emotion truly mine, or has it been planted within me by another? The unconscious manipulator does not force their way into your life. They slip quietly through the unguarded door of your unexamined empathy. Yet psychological danger does not always manifest as emotional turbulence or overt distress. Quite often it hides behind that which appears entirely flawless: the perpetual, radiant smile, the impeccable social posture, the utterly unblemished public image. We inhabit a world increasingly obsessed with superficial presentations, where the reality of being is routinely sacrificed for the illusion of seeming. In my investigations, I recognize this as a profound psychological calamity. When an individual identifies completely with their persona, that necessary social mask we construct to interact with society, they suffer a catastrophic disconnection from their true essence. And those who live exclusively for the mask not only erase their own inner life, but slowly destroy the psychological authenticity of everyone around them. In The Ego and the Unconscious, I define the persona as that which a person is not in reality, but what he and others believe him to be. It is an artificial construct, meticulously assembled from social expectations, cultural demands, and familial obligations. In its proper place, the persona is not an error, it is an indispensable tool. It allows us to fulfill distinct functions, to act as the physician, the scholar, the parent, or the citizen. The tragedy occurs when the ego identifies entirely with this outer shell. The mask becomes glued to the face. Spontaneity, vulnerability, and genuine human emotion are banished into the cold basement of the unconscious, while the individual remains trapped in a performance of perfection. This individual is the bearer of the persona, a master of functional superficiality. They speak precisely the words expected of them. They exhibit flawless decorum. They avoid genuine conflict at all costs. Yet behind this carefully maintained curtain of absolute control, the actual soul lies in ruins. The more energy expended to sustain the pristine image, the more the authentic self is smothered. If you are forced to coexist with a bearer of the persona, you will inevitably experience a persistent, subtle sense of wrongness that you cannot quite articulate. The interaction feels entirely devoid of psychic weight, spontaneous warmth, or true depth. Everything appears rehearsed, as if you are interacting with a well-crafted automaton. Even more disturbing is the quiet pressure applied to you. The bearer of the persona demands that you join their performance. They require you to read from the same script, to maintain the visual illusion, to participate in the theater. Should you express a raw emotion, a genuine doubt, or an unscripted pain, they instantly recoil. They become cold, anxious, or dismissive, not out of explicit hatred, but because your raw humanity threatens to crack the delicate veneer holding their fragile identity together. This intense identification with the social mask stands as one of the most formidable obstacles to what I have termed the individuation process, that arduous, lifelong journey towards psychological integration and self-realization. The danger crystallizes when the individual becomes utterly hypnotized by their role, believing themselves to be nothing more than the admiration or approval of others. When you live alongside someone who exists solely for external validation, your own commitment to truth is quietly eroded. You find yourself censoring your speech, suppressing your natural reactions, and hiding aspects of your nature that do not conform to their pristine narrative. Slowly, imperceptibly, you begin to wear a matching mask. The artificiality is contagious. Consider now what occurs when an individual suppresses their authentic feelings, thoughts, and impulses over extended periods. Those rejected elements do not simply evaporate into nothingness. They sink into the dark subterranean realm of the psyche, where they undergo a process of slow, volatile fermentation. Eventually, they consolidate into what I have named the shadow. This brings us to a far more dangerous psychological structure: the owner of the repressed shadow. These are individuals who appear impeccably composed, refined, exceptionally moderate, and unfailingly polite. Yet beneath this carefully manicured surface of moral correctness lies a psychological pressure vessel nearing its limit. Everything they deem dangerous, primitive, or socially unacceptable has been violently forced underground. It has not been processed. It has not been transformed. It has merely been concealed. In Aion, I observed that the shadow consists of those contents which the individual refuses to acknowledge within themselves, yet which insist on expressing themselves through indirect means. The shadow is not some external demonic force invading the world. It is an intimate, internal reality. It is the unacknowledged resentment you carry, the envy you rationalize away through superior logic, the intense instincts you deny, the ruthless ambition you disguise as humble service. Whatever you refuse to bring into the light of consciousness remains active in the dark, shaping your behavior, while your conscious ego remains utterly blind to it. As I have stated often, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The owner of the repressed shadow rarely appears threatening at first glance. Often, they are figures of considerable social respect, disciplined, helpful, dutiful. Yet, if you observe them closely, you will detect a rigid intolerance. They react with sudden, disproportionate severity to the small weaknesses or spontaneous expressions of others. They are visibly unsettled by intense emotional displays. They project an aura of quiet, compressed tension, constantly keeping their internal volcano capped until the pressure inevitably exceeds the container. When the explosion occurs, it is total and devastating. Because they live in constant terror of their own hidden depths, they maintain an uncompromising vigilance over those around them. They become hypercritical, moralistic, and controlling. Yet this intense preoccupation with the behavior of others is nothing more than a desperate attempt to suppress their own internal chaos. The stronger the persona is constructed, the darker and more concentrated the shadow becomes. And the longer that shadow is denied, the more brutal will be its eventual manifestation. You can identify this dynamic in individuals who exhibit sudden outbursts of wildly disproportionate rage, who harbor deep grudges over trivial slights, or who engage in relentless, passive-aggressive sabotage. They are the chronically bitter, hypercritical figures who poison their environments while maintaining complete ignorance as to why they are so intensely disliked. The answer lies in their unintegrated shadow. It is vital to understand that the shadow is not composed entirely of destructive elements. It also contains an enormous reservoir of raw vitality, denied creative potential, and uncultivated strength. But when it is systematically ignored, that rich instinctual energy degrades into poison, and that poison bleeds outward, contaminating every relationship, every household, and every mind unequipped to recognize it. Coexisting with such an individual is akin to treading upon an active minefield, where a single authentic step can detonate a hidden store of repressed fury. Frequently, this rigid repression is fortified by a profound illusion of ethical perfection, a rigid set of ideals that transforms human guilt into a potent weapon of psychological control. This leads us directly to the profile of the moral controller. Not every tyrant wields an instrument of force. Some accomplish their subjugation using sacred texts, ethical codes, unyielding principles, and highly refined ideological dogmas. These are individuals who claim to be motivated purely by virtue, duty, and higher principles, yet beneath their lofty declarations, they are engaged in building a psychological prison for themselves. and for anyone unfortunate enough to fall within their sphere of influence. When morality is used as a mechanism of avoidance, it becomes one of the most destructive forms of psychological distortion. The moral controller, rather than doing the difficult work of integrating their own shadow, projects that shadow outward onto the actions of others. They fiercely condemn in the world what they refuse to confront within their own hearts. You have undoubtedly encountered such individuals. They are quick to point an accusing finger, yet completely incapable of self-examination. They occupy the moral high ground not out of genuine spiritual attainment, but because they desperately require that elevated vantage point to preserve their fragile sense of inner purity. As I demonstrated throughout my research, the greater the internal repression, the more violent the imperative to project the shadow outward. The moral controller requires sinners, rebellious spirits, and corrupt individuals in order to externalize their own forbidden impulses. By condemning you, they temporarily relieve themselves of their own hidden guilt. The insidious nature of the moral controller lies in their unshakable conviction of their own righteousness. They genuinely believe that their severe judgments, unsolicited critiques, and emotional punishments are delivered out of love, duty, or concern for your welfare. They cloak their psychological hostility in phrases designed to disarm your resistance. I am only telling you this for your own good, or someone must have the courage to show you your flaws. But this truth is never neutral. It is heavy with projected darkness. In Aion, I explored the psychological archetypes of completeness and absolute division. The moral controller attempts to align themselves entirely with the light while completely denying their connection to the dark. This splits their psyche in two, rendering them exceptionally dangerous because they are blind to their own capacity for psychological cruelty. If you remain under the influence of a moral controller, you will find yourself burdened by an inexplicable, pervasive sense of guilt. You feel permanently inadequate, as if your very existence is somehow fundamentally flawed. The most destructive outcome is that you eventually internalize their cold judge. You begin to police your own harmless thoughts, suppress your natural instincts, and twist your personality to fit a rigid, unnatural standard that belongs to someone else. Their external dogma becomes your internal cell. Yet, as formidable as the moral controller may be, their behavior follows a rigid, predictable structure. There is another psychological dynamic that is far more volatile, unpredictable, and chaotic: the complexed individual. While the moral controller relies on rigid rules to manage their shadow, the complexed individual is periodically overthrown by powerful, autonomous fragments of their own unconscious. Imagine existing alongside someone whose emotional disposition shifts without warning. One moment they are warm, overwhelmingly affectionate, and deeply attentive. The next, they explode in incandescent rage, withdraw into an icy, punishing silence, or level wild accusations at you that have no foundation in objective reality. A casual observation is transformed into an intentional insult. A gentle joke is experienced as a devastating assault. An act of genuine care is decoded as a subtle attempt at control. With such a person, you are forced to navigate an entirely unstable reality. To understand this dynamic, one must grasp what I mean by a complex. Complexes are autonomous, emotionally charged clusters of memories, associations, and instinctual patterns residing in the unconscious. They operate like independent mini-personalities within the larger psyche, formed primarily through early psychic trauma, unhealed wounds, and suppressed experiences. In my work on psychological types and within the ego and the unconscious, I illustrated how a complex, when activated by an external trigger, can temporarily usurp the ego. When a complex takes the wheel, the individual ceases to react to the reality of the present moment. Instead, they are completely possessed by the emotional architecture of an old trauma. A simple, harmless comment by a partner unconsciously triggers a deep-seated complex of abandonment or humiliation. and the partner is suddenly forced to pay the emotional debt of a ghost from 30 years past. The tragedy of the complexed individual is that they are entirely unaware of this internal possession. When they react with irrational fury or intense despair, their conscious mind instantly creates a rationalization. They firmly believe their extreme reaction is completely justified by your conduct. They cannot perceive that they are merely reenacting an undigested historical wound. Because these psychological invasions occur sporadically, the relationship becomes deeply addictive and confusing. Between these emotional storms, there are often periods of extraordinary warmth, deep lucidity, and profound intimacy. You tell yourself, this is who they truly are. The rest was just a temporary lapse. This cycle traps you. You begin to adapt your entire existence to minimize the outbreaks. You carefully weigh every word, monitor your expressions, eliminate topics of conversation, and continuously walk on eggshells, desperately attempting to avoid awakening the dormant entity within them. Yet, hear this truth clearly, you do not awaken their complex. The complex is an permanent internal structure within their psyche, latent, hungry, and waiting for any plausible external hook upon which to hang its ancient pain. And when it rises to the surface, it consumes everything in its path. When an unrecognized complex systematically colonizes an individual's mind, it speaks through them, feels through them, and acts through them. They may be driven by an inferiority complex, a martyrdom complex, a persecution complex, or a betrayal complex, each equipped with its own rigid script and insatiable demands. The more you attempt to pacify them, the more you feed the illusion that their internal wounds can be cured by your external submission. Coexisting with such an individual subjects your own mind to severe wearing. The present is continuously contaminated by unburied history. In time, you begin to doubt your own memory, your own emotional stability, and your own sanity. Without realizing it, your own psychological boundaries dissolve, and your mind is colonized by the unresolved chaos of another. This brings us to the final, most quiet, and perhaps most draining profile of all, one that operates not through explosive rage or moral decree, but through an inexhaustible, quiet consumption of your vital force. This is the psychic vampire. There are individuals who do not desire your actual presence or your authentic individuality. They seek your energy. They do not utilize overt violence or aggressive hostility. Instead, they operate through subtle, continuous emotional demands, chronic self-victimization, and a profound pathological dependency disguised as deep affection. In my writings, while I did not employ the modern phrase, psychic vampire, I spent considerable effort describing the dynamics of the pathological symbiotic relationship. This is a state wherein two personalities cease to exist as distinct, bounded subjects, and instead collapse into a parasitic psychological fusion that halts all genuine individuation. In The Ego and the Unconscious and Aion, I emphasize that the fundamental goal of human psychological development is to differentiate oneself from the collective and from the overwhelming pull of the unconscious to become a whole, distinct individual. The psychic vampire lives in direct opposition to this imperative. They carry an overwhelming internal void, an empty abyss resulting from their refusal to develop their own psychic resources.